I'd now like to ask Dr. Clíodhna ó Lionáin to take the podium, please. And we all remember the excitement of finding a new passage tomb in the Boyne Valley in 2017. When we always say, those of us who work at Brúna, that it is the place that keeps on giving. And there are no end to the surprises that are in store, and there are still secrets to be discovered. But to reveal her story and the story of the forgotten monument, here's Dr. Clíodhna ó Lionáin. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. So today I'm going to be talking about the relatively recent rediscovery of a lost and forgotten monument, the Dowth Hall passage tomb. And we've been working there over the last few years. The excavation has been fully funded by the landowner Devenish, and the main phases of the dig were undertaken in collaboration with UCD School of Archaeology. And I think it's really quite appropriate that my presentation follows the wonderful talk that Kerry has just given us, because what they achieved at Dowth through the hard work of Professor Ogan and his team, and more recently the Trojan work by Kerry and Dr. Shea Tuig in getting the later volumes across the line, has been to create this amazing resource, not only for the wider archaeological community, but for those passage tomb excavators that came after them. And definitely on more than one occasion when we were digging at Dowth Hall, especially when we'd be scratching our head about something, inevitably a voice in the team would pop up. I wonder what George would do in this situation. And throughout this process, the voices of the people who came before us, the excavators and other archaeologists who worked in the area, but also the people who have been engaging, interacting with and building this monument, they definitely were sort of ever present as we tried to rediscover this monument. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Dowth Hall, the passage tomb is located on a large estate that we call the Devenish lands at Dowth. It's more than 430 acres in size and represents a fifth of the core area of the UNESCO World Heritage Site. The core area is shown here in pink, and the estate is sort of that solid kind of lilac-coloured block. The Dowth Hall passage tomb is located on the eastern end of that shale ridge, which was the focus of a lot of activity in the Neolithic. 3 fields to the west, we have the large passage tomb at Dowth, which, to avoid confusion, I often call Big Dowth, because it's twice the size of what we found at Dowth Hall. But originally it was actually part of the same estate, but it's been under state ownership for quite some time. Further west, we have the 2 other megamounds of Dowth and Newgrange. And even though these are twice the size of the Dowth Hall passage tomb, I think we should still consider Dowth Hall part of this phenomenon of building these larger focal monuments. And in particular, if we look at the size of Tomb 1B at Dowth, the dimensions at Dowth Hall are really quite similar. But before I get into the nitty-gritty of the excavation, I want to just look at this issue of how some monuments end up being remembered and some are forgotten by looking at the archaeological sites and architectural structures in the immediate vicinity of the excavation. So starting off with Dowth Hall itself, this neoclassical Georgian villa, we think building of it started in the 1740s and construction was completed around 1765. But this photo from 1915 is actually the earliest depiction we have of the house. We haven't been able to find any sketches, watercolours, or even the architectural plans. So even though this house is still very visible and is physically within our current cultural landscape, we still have quite a few gaps in our memory about it. To the east of the site, we have Dowth Henge, which was probably the best known monument on the estate up until the discovery of the passage tomb. This is a lovely aerial shot taken by Ken Williams, and I'm just going to take this moment to say that all of the aerial shots and all of the photos that will make you go, ooh, they're all taken by Ken. Dowth Henge is a late Neolithic enclosure. It's the second largest of henge on the island of Ireland, second only to Ballinahattie or the Giant's Ring outside of Belfast. If you stand in the centre of the monument and look out its western entrance, you'll see that it seems to be perfectly aligned on Dowth Hall, Obviously, that's not the case. It's probably aligned on what was lying underneath it. Dowth Henge is still quite monumental. Its banks are surviving up to 6 metres high in places, so it's still very visibly present in our landscape. But there's also the possibility that it became the backdrop of some early Irish myths and legends. And there's a story called Fla Dúnanay, or the Banquet of Dúnanay. Dúnanay means the Fort of the Geese. And according to this, there was a High King of Ireland, King Donal, who built a new palace. And to celebrate this, he threw a big party and requested that all the goose eggs in Ireland be brought there. So some of his followers headed down the road to Slane, where they came across the hermitage of Bishop Arch, who wasn't at home. They went in and found a vessel full of goose eggs, and they stole it. Arch then put a curse on the banquet that ultimately led to King Donal falling out with his foster son Conall Ceach, who was the King of Ulster, and that led to the Battle of Moyrath in 637 AD. John O'Donovan in 1842 translated both of these stories, so the banquet is kind of like a prequel for the battle. And in one of the footnotes, while acknowledging that none of the local people in the area remembered this place name of Dúnanay, he suggests that it was probably referring to a large fort near Dowth. He says it was on the south side of the Boyne, but a few years later, William Wilde specifically identifies it as being Dowth Henge. Now, we'll never know if this attribution of this story to Dowth Henge is just a 19th century invention or if it has its roots to an older attribution. But it shows how these legends and tales can end up being connected to monuments that are still physically visible. To the west of the house, we have Site I and Site J. So these are two small mounds, both of which are passage tombs, and they were given these letters as sort of part of George Coffey's categorisation system. But even prior to that, they were being recorded in the historic OS maps as early as 1836. This is actually the second edition map, dating to 1882, 1883, and you can see both Site I and Site J there. Site I is described as a moat and Site J is described as a cave, because at some point prior to 1836, someone removed the capstone of the chamber and put it to one side, and you can look into it, so it does look a little bit like a cave. And then further west, we have Big Dowth again. Obviously, this is a very monumental site, still very present in our own cultural landscape, and it has been remembered in a variety of different ways. We have this beautiful watercolour done by Gabriel Beranger in 1775. During his visit to the estate, he also painted another site just to the northeast of Dowth Henge, a site he believed to be a stone circle, which is no longer visible. And unfortunately, when he did come to Dowth, Dowth Hall was probably already 10 years old, so the passage tomb underneath was no longer visible for him to illustrate. But we also get older references to Dowth in our sort of historic sources, including this reference in the Annals of Ulster to an event that they say happened around 863, when the Vikings, probably from Dublin, sailed up the Boyne and attacked a series of mounds or caves, including that of Boadan's Mound above Dowth. So just by looking at the immediate vicinity of Dowth Hall, we see the different ways that monuments can be remembered. We can have legends and myths about them. We can have illustrations, cartographic representations. They can physically survive. But we also have local folklore and local knowledge about these sites. But for some reason, Dowth Hall Passage Tomb was not remembered in any of these ways. So I think we need to look at the excavation now to try and understand what happened to it during its life that it slipped so totally into oblivion. So we started excavating here in 2017, and the first structures we came across had to do with the house itself. The house has a feature called an external basement, so it's like a tunnel that wraps around the house, and it's accessed by a series of servants' tunnels. We also found evidence for the wings of the house, because originally the house had two wings. We found part of the southern wing, that feature called a bowed projection. It's like a semicircular bay that would have gone up the elevation of the wing. As we went down deeper, we found something much, much older, which was the remains of a large passage tomb around 40 metres in diameter. It has 2 burial chambers, both on the western side of the mound, and we found the remains of a curb. We have 5 curbstones in that little green bubble, and there's actually a 6th curbstone to the east of that during the 18th century period was turned at right angles to the line of the curb and incorporated into a servant's tunnel. The mound of this monument is primarily a stone cairn, most of which is quarried sandstone. So as you can see from this photo, it's a real jigsaw sort of puzzle of a site with lots of different layers of intervention that need to be deciphered. To date, I've identified provisionally at least 8 phases in the life of this monument. We've evidence for activity prior to the construction of the stone element of the mound. Obviously, the next phase was the building of the chambers, the curb, the cairn, and how these chambers were used. Then we've a phase that I call deliberate decommissioning. So we've evidence that the chambers at least were being dismantled intentionally and infilled. I have a question mark for it here rather than number 3 because we need more dating to be sure where it fits into this sequence. We also have evidence for Beaker activity that was later sealed by substantial episodes of cairn slippage. And then again at a later point, someone has come along and tried to redefine the perimeter of this monument, and we have a cremation burial inserted into the slippage. We also have a relatively significant medieval building intervention, and obviously the most significant building intervention of all was the construction of Dowth Hall, pretty much in the centre of the monument. But looking at these different phases, I realised that we're forgetting a phase, because as archaeologists, we often see ourselves just strictly as scientific, objective observers, but the work we carry out on these sites and the work it inspires is also an interaction with this passage tomb and its most recent phase, which is that of 21st century rediscovery and excavation. So I'm going to hopefully cover this long life of more than 5,000 years in the next 25 minutes or so, and we'll start with the Precare and Activity. So we found a number of pits underneath the cairn. We have 2 small pits just to the east of the chamber of Tomb 1. Further south, we have this larger pit. It's got a nice charcoal layer, so hopefully we'll be getting good dates from it, and 2 smaller pits to the west and southwest of that. These features don't seem to be forming any structure, and because we haven't our dating finished on it yet, we don't know how soon, what the relationship it is with the monument. Are they just a couple of years older than the monument or a couple of 100 years? But the most significant layer of pre-cairn activity that we identified was actually a phase of site preparation that sealed those pits. And that was the deposition of multiple buried grass sod layers under the entire footprint of the cairn. This aerial photo, you'll be able to make out the sort of smeary yellow-grey clay, and you should be able to see depressions in it, which are the lower stones of the cairn. We have taken micromorphology samples, which are being studied by Dr. Helen Lewis, but even to the naked eye, looking at the back of the samples, I could see at least 4 or 5 turf lines. So when you think about the logistical implications of this, getting all of this sod to site, but also the visible impact that it had on the donor sites, this was quite a significant piece of work, all done before the stone elements of the monument were built. This lovely photo of Tomb 1 here, we've excavated Tomb 1 pretty extensively. You can see just sort of on the right-hand side of the photo, the 18th century tunnel, how close it comes to the chamber. Our aerial shot here shows we have 7 in situ orthostats in the eastern part of the chamber that form 3 stalls. The chamber floor is this sticky, compact clay, and we might have an angular stone setting. We've got 2 stones at right angles to each other. We haven't exposed it fully because to the west it's underneath a stone layer that runs under a series of collapsed structural stones. One of these collapsed structural stones here probably formed the western side of stall C. It's underneath a sort of subcircular shaped stone that we think could have been the roof stone for that stall. Further to the southwest, we have another very similarly shaped stone, so could that have been the roof stone for the passage? This stone lying to the east of it looks like it's a lintel, so again, was it traversing the passage? And this orthostat here, I think could be marking the transition between the passage and the chamber, both from where it's located, but also the art that it bears. So the upper third of this stone is covered with this lovely sort of stacked chevron motif, and sort of reminds me of stones like the guardian stones and stones put in special places, in sort of places of transition. 5 of our stones in total from Tomb 1 are decorated. We've got a mixture of pecked motif and some lovely, sort of really lightly incised motifs as well. We've also found original chamber deposits, and they've shown us that at least 2 of the stalls were treated in quite different ways. This is stall A, and in it we have more than 130 stone balls that were pressed into that sticky clay floor. Now, these stone balls are not carved, they're naturally occurring, and they're found sometimes in blocks of sandstone. During the formation process, there's a little piece of grit or a fossil, and these sort of perfect little spheres form around it. So when the passage tomb builders were off quarrying the sandstone to build their cairn, they were obviously coming across these little oddities, putting them to one side, so curating them, and then when the chamber was ready, they were depositing them there as ritual object. So I think it's really nice the way they're using these naturally occurring sort of little anomalies and converting them into cultural objects. To the stall immediately north of that, in stall B, it's being treated in a completely different way. This is actually a composite photo. Inside the little yellow box, we've got this orthostat that was collapsed, but when we were lifting it, we were able to put it back in its socket. Stall B, they put a layer of soil onto the chamber floor that was rich in cremated bone, and then they covered that or sealed that with a stone surface or floor, and more cremated bone was deposited on top of that. But it wasn't just cremated bone that we were finding, we were also getting unburnt human remains, and this is a mandible that's located near that stone setting. So the mandible is in 2 pieces. We did wet sieving of soil immediately in the area, and we found the chin as well, and it looks like it's all belonging to the same individual, an adult female. We've been lucky that our unburnt human remains have been incorporated into Dr. Lara Cassidy's ancient DNA project in Trinity, and as part of that we've been able to get dates. So this mandible dates to between 3191 and 3009 Cal BC, so well within that main period of use for Dowth and Newgrange. If we move around 16.5 metres to the south, we come to Tomb 2, which wasn't excavated as extensively. Most of the work was just removing the 18th century terrace material that covered it, but we also excavated a trench immediately to the east. And we were able to get an idea of what this chamber might have looked like. We found the northern extent of the chamber and a number of in situ orthostats, which suggests that the plan was a large central chamber area, and then off to the east we have a side chamber. This side chamber is quite interesting because we have like a foundation cut for the chamber, and that foundation cut was lined with those buried grass sod layers, so you'll make out that sort of grey, smeary, rust-coloured soil. That's buried grass sod. If we look a bit closer, we see we've this large horizontal stone that, for all intents and purposes, looks like a collapsed orthostat, and you might think it was knocked over by that modern structure just to the right of it. But during the excavation, we found that that horizontal stone was sealed by a thick soil layer that was cut by that modern structure. So that stone got into that horizontal position before Dowth Hall was built. So there's 2 theories about how that happened. It could have been during a phase of deliberate decommissioning and dismantling, and whoever was knocking it over was doing it very carefully, ensuring that it fell within a few millimetres of the orthostat to the south of it and landed on this vertical prop. The second theory was this could have been part of the original design. So we've a horizontal stone that's propped up, could it have been used as a basin or something like that, and then the back of the chamber was filled in using dry stone walling or other orthostats. This stone outlined in green is the largest structural stone on the site, and it's actually only one of 2 of the structural stones that are not grey wacky. This is sandstone, and the underside of it is covered with a series of cut marks, some of which seem to be forming motifs. We think this could have formed part of the roof of the side chamber and slipped down, or it was part of the central chamber roofing. To the north of the chamber, immediately outside of it, we think we found part of a construction ramp that was built directly on the buried grass sod layer. The ramp is composed of a layer of smaller stones, and then they put another sod layer on top of it. This ramp sort of leans down, slopes down into that orthostat, so it could have been used to help put it into position or help support it once it was in place. Like Tomb 1, we're not exactly sure where the passage was, but we think it was either to the southwest or south. I think it was to the south, because you might see we've got this outlier orthostat there that I think could be a passage orthostat. Here we have an aerial shot of our curb with the 5 ones that are still visible. 3 of them are in situ and 2 have fallen out of place, including the most westerly one here, which is our most decorated curbstone, covered in concentric circles and spiral designs. This is what the curb looks like when you're standing on the ground, and I like this photo because it gives a good sense of the palimpsest nature of this site. The red line there is the extent of the cairn surviving in this part of the site. The maximum height of cairn that we have is around 1.60 m. Above the red line, you can see the 18th century basement structures that were built using that cairn material. So you can see how similar it looks. So in the 18th century, the builders came and dug a big hole in the centre and reused the material. And then sort of perched on top of it all, we have the Georgian villa of Dowth Hall. Now I just want to move on to the phase that I call deliberate decommissioning. And by this I mean we've a process of dismantling of at least one of the chambers, maybe both, that was done very carefully and in a way to ensure that no more burials could be inserted there. This aerial shot of Tomb 1 shows it when we'd removed all of the modern material. So the site was left with these sort of orthostats peeking out like little fingers and the interior of the chamber filled in with stone. As we excavated through the stone infill, we came across those collapsed structural stones I showed you earlier, but we also came across human bone being used in really interesting ways. This skull is found just outside stall A. It's an adult female skull, and it's the top part of the head and the upper part of the face, and it's been turned upside down, acting like a little bowl nearly, because inside it we found finger and hand bones belonging to other individuals. So there's an adult finger bone, but also juvenile finger bones belonging to 2 different infants, one of which was younger than 1 year old, the other older than 1 year. And we also found the claw of a small animal. So this shows that this was not just an accidental inclusion. It was placed very carefully, and someone has gone to the trouble of gathering these other remains and putting them inside it. To the west, sitting on that collapsed orthostat with that lovely stacked chevron motif, we have this adult male mandible. Both this and the skull were included in Dr. Cassidy's project, and we got Chalcolithic dates from both in a very close range to each other. So does this mean that this act of deliberate decommissioning happened during the Chalcolithic, and the people who were doing it chose remains of people known to them or close to them to mark closing deposits? I think that's quite a strong theory at the moment. The other option is that this dismantling happened at a later date, and it's just a coincidence that the person who chose the bone for human sort of closing deposits happened to choose Chalcolithic remains. We are going to be doing more dating because we've animal bone associated in close proximity to the skull, including a hair jawbone, so I'm hoping that'll help tie down when this event took place. We also have evidence for Beaker activity to the south of the curb. So in sort of the early cairn slippage layers to the south of the curb, we found lithics that could be attributed to this period, including this petit tranché arrowhead in the centre. In layers slightly above it, we found a charcoal-rich layer that had a lot of pottery inclusions in it. Apologies for the photograph, but hopefully you might be able to make out the little white pieces of paper, each of which is for a piece of pottery. Some of that pottery has been provisionally identified as Beaker. And what's interesting is the curbstone just in front of it. because when that curbstone is wet, we can see that there's a patch of red in the centre that could be the result of a fire being set against this curb, possibly in the Chalcolithic period. This layer containing Beaker pottery was sealed by the more substantial layers of cairn slippage. So a lot of our work during the excavation was trying to distinguish between what's real cairn and what's slippage. The slippage covered our 2 ex situ curbstones, and at a later point, the slippage itself was cut by a ditch that runs east-west across this part of the site. Unfortunately, there's not anything particularly diagnostic from the ditch. We're finding pieces of worked quartz, but in terms of datable material, it's pretty thin on the ground there. But it looks like it was an attempt to put shape back on this mound that had sort of burst its banks a little. To the north of the ditch, but still in the cairn slippage, at some point someone inserted a cremation burial. It's in a simple pit where they've just removed a few stones from the cairn slippage and filled it up to the top with cremated bone and then sealed it with another stone. And the stone you can see was sort of like the little capstone, and a lot of the cremated bone was still adhering to it. There's nearly 4.5 kilos of burnt bone in that pit, representing at least 3 individuals, 2 adults and 1 non-adult. So an individual surviving to late childhood, but no later than 17 or 18. So if we move forward again, in time we'll come to the medieval activity on the site. During the excavation campaign in 2018, to the north of Tomb 2, we found the entrance to what appears to be a souterrain. This is a dry stone structure. The walls are constructed using material from the cairn, and they have put down a clay floor in the interior. Just to the right of the pointy end of the ranging rod there's a little step down, and it was heading off somewhere beyond the extent of our excavation. In our most recent campaign, just at the end of the last year, we found out where that souterrain actually ended up going. I was excavating just along the northern extent of the chamber of Tomb 2, just trying to identify if there were more orthostats. We found 2 new orthostats, and then we found this stone, which looked like a roof stone, and there was a tantalising gap beside it. We opened up a wider sondage so we could get sort of head and the upper part of the body through, and this is what we saw on the inside. The lovely dry stone walls of a souterrain, and unfortunately not the orthostatic walls of a Neolithic passage. So we found out where the souterrain ended up. It actually breached the chamber wall, which is really quite unusual. While we do have souterrains inserted into passage tombs, they tend to target the passage. This is the first I know of where the chamber wall has been breached. And as disappointing as it was that it wasn't the passage to the chamber, it's also told us a lot about what the site might have looked like at this time. If you look at the upper part of the photo, that roof stone that I showed you earlier, it's actually probably a chamber orthostat that was flipped into position. So I think this tells us that the site was already a ruin at this stage, because it would have been very difficult to tease out that orthostat if the chamber superstructure was sitting on top of it. But what's also interesting is the dry stone structure that has been built on top of it. And I'm going to try and use this, but oh yes. So we've got a dry stone wall here. It's built on top of another collapsed orthostat, and it's capped with this layer here that until relatively recently I was calling Neolithic corbelling. But what was, for me, is interesting is that being able to build that dry stone structure suggests that this part of the site was open. But also, why did they build what I call the fake corbelling, to cover not only the breach point, but they continue it across to cover the original orthostats? And sort of my theory is that this was probably a well-known ruin in the area, and they didn't want people to know that they had inserted their souterrain into it. So they're trying to cover their tracks and make it look as if there's nothing to see here. But this chamber is still filled with around 1.20 meters of infill. So without excavating the rest of that, it's really difficult to understand the true impact of what the medieval intervention had on it. Moving on to the 18th and 19th century building interventions. So we need to think about what the builders would have seen on their first day on site back in the 1740s. I don't think, and I hope I might have helped convince you as well, I don't think they were coming across a fully intact monument. I think it was very denuded, possibly truncated horizontally, could have looked like a rocky outcrop with little stones peeping out. And the reason I believe this is what the excavation evidence is telling us, but also the silence that surrounds this site in antiquarian sources. So there's no reference to there being an intact mound there. There's no outcry to a mound being destroyed. And we have to remember that antiquarians were operating this area for at least 40 years by the time Dowth Hall was constructed. But more importantly, there's absolutely no knowledge or reference of the site in local history and folklore, which again suggests that the site was a ruin, but also sort of suggests that the people who were working, the 18th century builders, I don't think any of them were drawn from the local community, because obviously the stories would have gone back, you'll never guess what we found on the job today. In the 19th century, there were more building interventions when the basement structures were extended and modified, and to the north of the house, this courtyard was built, and that actually truncated 2 possible satellite tombs. But unfortunately, that's a story for another day. I don't have time to go into that today. So just trying to draw this to a close, I want to go back to the theme of how certain monuments are forgotten and others are remembered. And what was it about Dowth Hall Passage Tomb and its life that ended up with it being completely forgotten? And I think the seeds sort of on the road to oblivion were planted during that period of deliberate decommissioning, which could have occurred as early as the Chalcolithic. Now, I don't think this decommissioning was intended to be a complete obliteration of the site. It was to close it off, to finish that sort of phase of its life. And indeed, it was unsuccessful in obliterating it totally, because it was remembered over the next millennia up until the early medieval period. Even during the early medieval period, I think it was still visible in the cultural landscape of the time, but probably as a ruin. But something happened between the early medieval period and when Dowth Hall was built, and the passage tomb just completely slipped away from our memory. Could it have been that it just became so overgrown that those local stories and pishogues about the site lost that link to something tangible and was forgotten? Could it have something to do with the fact that in this period, this land came into the possession of an Anglo-Norman family, the Nettervilles, and while locals probably still had access, it was probably more reduced than it was prior to them coming into possession. Whatever pushed it over the edge, we know that for at least 260 years, this site lay hidden and forgotten until it entered its most recent phase of archaeological excavation, or as I like to call it, the recuperation of the memories of this site. And in this sort of process of rediscovery, we've been helped by so many people. I'm not going to read all of this out, but I want to thank everyone who has been so generous with their time, expertise and skill, for the people who've included our material into their own research projects. But like with all excavations, the foundation for all of this work is the field crew, who have worked in all kind of conditions, literally from drought to snow, spending most of their time covered in mud, but every now and then cleaning up for the odd media event. And with the day that's in it, and sort of looking at the theme of remembering the work of the people who came before us, I'd obviously like to acknowledge the work of Professor Ogan. We were delighted to invite himself and Fiona up onto site on a couple of times. You can see George was a natural with the selfie. And I'd also like to remember another George who was very important to us, Professor Sevastopolo, who was a little bit more uncomfortable with the selfie taking, but who was so generous in sharing his time and expertise with us, and was actually still working on the geological report for Dowth Hall up until his death. So I'd like to dedicate this to the two Georges. Thanks.